Hello. In this episode of Airs for Architecture, I speak with Dr. Beth Weinstein, Acting Associate Dean for Student Affairs and Associate Professor of Architecture at the University of Arizona, about her 2024 book, Architecture and Choreography, Collaborations in Dance, Space and Time.
A is for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Airs for Architecture. I'm talking today to architect, scholar, dancer, Beth Weinstein. Beth, would you be so kind as to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. First, thanks for the opportunity to have this conversation with you. I'm really honored. Yes, I am an architect, trained at Columbia University, but
Are you a
also
New Yorker?
I am a New Yorker. And prior to completing my master's at Columbia, I studied design at Syracuse University and quite recently completed a practice-based PhD at the University of Tasmania in Australia with a focus on installation and performance. The primary hat that I wear is as a educator in architecture. So I'm an associate professor at the University of Arizona in Tucson. And I also chair the object and spatial design emphasis areas of our Bachelor of Arts in Design Arts Practice.
That's a busy life.
Yeah, it is.
And what I kind of want to get to Tucson. Not Tucson, sorry, Tasmania. How did you get there? Who specifically was there that drew you in?
I was quite informally mentored by Dorita Hanna, who is from New Zealand, Aotearoa, New Zealand. And she's an architect who went on to pursue a PhD in performance studies at NYU. And so through meeting her through Performance Studies International and through her editing an issue of the Journal of Architectural Education, the US Journal of Architectural Education, on performance and architecture, I got to meet her. And as I was saying, she was kind of an unofficial mentor for probably close to a dozen years before I decided to take on a PhD, and she was at the University of Tasmania at that time. And I was interested in the potential of the practice-based format of not only researching about, but researching through
Yeah.
architecture, performance, installation as a kind of an expanded mode of practice. So that's what got me down under.
Brilliant. And how was it?
It was very full on. I completed the PhD in like 3.5 years, and it was very intense.
Yeah, you're not in Kansas now, Dorothy.
No,
The drive to finish PhDs in other places is quite a thing.
yeah, and as I was saying, it was both full of research about questions I'd never really asked before, to be totally honest,
Hmm.
and and then making a body of work
Mm.
through installations and performances
That sounds really
about
wonderful.
that. And much of it was also um, living out of suitcases, not in Arizona, um, in remote sites, and also doing work in Paris, where I've spent a lot of time, and then wrapping it all up in
So
Tasmania.
you were a performer as well, and this is what kind of performer? It's too general a term. I want to know a bit more on how did you do this? Because what we're going to be talking about and the reason for our conversation, other than the fact that a person from Southeast England and a person from Tucson, Arizona should probably talk more often, is your rather incredible book, Architecture Plus Choreography, or Architecture and Choreography,
Yeah.
Collaborations in Dance, Space and Time, which you published with Routledge. And we've been trying to organize this conversation for ages. And it says I know it only came out in this year, so I haven't been
Yeah.
so slow. I feel quite proud of myself. And you say in the beginning that, you know, you intimate, at least as I understood it, that you were yourself a dancer.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, there's a word I don't really know how to translate from French to English.
Try it.
Uh, Aborder.
No idea.
I would say my first my first form of knowledge about space was through dance. J'ai abordé l'espace à la danse. Um, so before studying architecture, before having that light bulb go off as like a kid saying, I want to be an architect. I love cities and buildings. I had already, one could say, been exploring and building knowledge about space through the body, through, taking ballet classes, modern dance classes, being involved in making performances through primary education and junior high school and all of that. So performance has always been a part of what I have been involved in.
Hmm.
And when I relocated from New York to Tucson, Arizona to take the job that I currently hold, it was an opportunity for me to take what had been at the periphery of my practice, like my weird nights and weekends being involved with performance groups, both as the kind of in-house resident designer, but oftentimes also performer, spatial strategist, contractor, builder. um, it was a chance to say, as opposed to marginalizing this within my own life, I'm going to take this thing, which is what I'm really interested in, move it to the center. So being involved in making installations and performances, working in collaboration with choreographers, dancers, as well as other visual artists, has been something that I've been involved in, even even in even in school as a kid before. Um, I think the turning point, which I discuss in the introduction to the book, was while I was in graduate school with three of my colleagues. We collaborated with a choreographer, the late Gus Solomons Jr. And that opportunity to be in dialogue with a choreographer who happened to be a choreographer who had studied architecture at MIT. And I didn't know this at the time, but he had also danced with Merce Cunningham. And so he had a very particular idea about how one goes about working with space, how one goes about designing movement and time and event, bodies in space. And so I think that that encounter as a 20-something-year-old was the first moment when it became real for me to be able to imagine that one can bring architecture and choreography into really close proximity and have a very fertile exchange of knowledge, exchange of practice to see how ideas from architecture can then become ideas that manifest in the way bodies um, move, occupy, interact in space, and to learn as an architect from this live unfolding event and to begin to see space support event live. Like not like here I am drawing on my drawing board and fantasizing about what people are going to do in my building 5 years from now when it eventually gets built. But I'm seeing this one-to-one prototype, if you will, and seeing how they are pushing the boundaries of what a body can do and be in relationship to a space. And that was very exciting to be able to see that kind of live feedback. So that's kind of what got me on this slippery slope, or I guess, just kind of always been on this particular incline.
I think sounds very fascinating, and there's so much in there that I kind of intuitively understand, but I think there's a whole host of nested ideas in there that I'd like to kind of understand a little bit better. I mean, firstly, and rather, I suppose, rather asininely, what is choreography? There must be more than one thing. It must be
Yeah.
a mode of practice, and like technically, practically, what is it? And I suppose, in terms of your own research in this book, what have been the principal avenues of choreographic practice that you've been most drawn towards or explored?
Hmm. So I'm going to give you a couple of different potential definitions. Um,
Which I assume somewhere along the line is going to upset somebody because they'll be like, that's not the choreo.
well, it's impossible to define any of these things. For my students, one of the first lectures I give them is like, what is design? And the first thing we do is we realize that there are many, many contradictory definitions of design. Um, So we could say choreography is the writing of dances. It is the writing with bodies in a space that brings bodies together. William Forsythe, choreographer whose work is this I discuss in the book, uh, has spoken about choreography as the organization of bodies in relationship to other bodies, in relationship to a space that is organized. And that definition of choreography for me is might as well be architecture. Or if we flip it, if we invert the formula, it's an organization of spaces in relationship to bodies in relationship to other bodies that are organized or disorganized. We could say that choreography is the design of moving and still bodies in space and time. Uh, it is the conceptualization and the writing. It is the exploration with the body that becomes assembled and aggregated into um, constituent parts of what might be a dance. It's the design of flows.
Uh-huh.
And in that way, it is very much related to architecture and urban design.
Hmm. And it's normally seen in relation to dance, I suppose, but is it a coded thing? Is it something that is written? I mean, I understand someone like William Forsythe or Matthew Bourne or any of the other great choreographers that they get later people produce their ballets as if it's a text.
So yeah, and there are many people who theorize this far better than I do, and I point to those folks in the book. But yeah, their choreography does, in the etymology, does suggest that there's a writing, right? There's a graphy. Um, and you could say this it is written on other bodies, not unlike architecture where we draw sets of instructions that are then carried out by other individuals in other spaces and times. In it, abstractly, you could say that choreography is the design of a dance. It is a set of instructions that is carried out by other bodies in perhaps another space and time. It can also be danced by the author,
Mm.
but in a certain way, it is a set of commands. One of the scholars that I refer to in the book talks about dance is an art of command. I instruct you to move this way in this timing and this sequence in relationship to these other bodies. Or I authorize you to innovate. I authorize you to improvise. Maybe I give you some instructions about how I want you to improvise. And I'm quite interested in, and though I don't really quite get into this so much in the book, but I'm interested in this notion that architects make instructions and we tend to be pretty prescriptive, but we could also make instructions which are quite open-ended and allow our builder, dialoguer, collaborator to have latitude and agency to improvise within a defined rule set that we establish.
Mhm.
And so I think it's interesting the way in both architecture and choreography, there is an author, but there's somebody else who ultimately is empowered to carry that out.
Mhm.
And there's a really interesting opportunity um, for giving agency to the performer, builder, dancer, um, to interpret.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, yeah, for sure. For sure.
I don't know if I answered your question.
Maybe, but you certainly answered a question, and it was elegantly done and fascinating to listen to, actually. Very, very beautiful. You speak with great precision about it, which I enjoy listening to. You posit this idea at the start of your book, which you unpack through the book, of archichoreography, the archichoreographic, which is, as I understand it, about the way that not only is bodily movements spatial, as I put in my notes to you, but also that the space of the performance mediates the bodily movement. I kind of would like to understand this a little bit more and perhaps some examples of what you mean by this archichoreography.
I was thinking about this morning, and I want to acknowledge that I was doing my PhD at the same time as another architect interested in choreography, and she had chosen the term choreo architecture to describe the work that she was doing because she was yeah, work, and it raised the question, why did I put the archi or the archi, because I mispronounce it in French, the archi chorégraphique. Why do I put the archi before the choreography as opposed to the other way around? And
That's a really good question.
it's a really good question, and that would be like a whole other chapter of the PhD that didn't happen. But that maybe is a future.
Yeah, archi-choreographic versus choreographic architectural or choreo-architectural. Yeah, I can see that.
So, because what I'm studying in the book is the collaboration between an architect and a choreographer, in which, generally speaking, the choreographer, I'm gonna phone there, in which, generally speaking, but not always, it's the choreographer who is the initiator of the collaboration and the primary person who is invited to make a work, commissioned to make a work, has the relationship with the commissioning institution, and is ultimately the person who's responsible, or the group of people responsible for the life of the work. The choreo is the primary thing modified by or conjugated through the architecture,
Hmm.
which is why the architecture is um, a prefix added to the beginning of the choreo.
Hmm.
And there are probably many archichoreographic things that I don't even talk about in the book, and I probably haven't even begun to think about deeply enough yet, um, because of the curiosity and desire to really unpack the collaboration and what emerges in between a choreographer and an architect when they
Hmm.
decide to work together, and how do their different approaches to working with bodies in space and time impact one another, hopefully challenge and stretch one another's practice and yield something, hopefully that was completely unanticipated,
Hmm.
um, because those conversations, those being in the room and being exposed to the others, the others' ways of working, draw into question assumptions that we have about our own ways of working.
Yeah,
And I think fundamentally that's what motivated the book, and that's the kind of dominant thought, I would say,
yeah.
that is explored. There are many other things one could say, one could question, such as what is what is an choreographic practice? What
Mm.
happens when that practice resides within the same practitioner?
Hmm.
Um, that's a question that I don't even get to in the
No.
book. And I think it's something that I ask in my own practice, of how is it that through the making of ephemeral architectures, I'm also choreographing the experience of members of the public as they enter into an installation or an environment? Or how is the performance of my labor making a drawing or making a space? How is that oscillating between a designing of moving bodies and a designing of space
Hmm.
and a designing of an audience relationship, observing or being immersed within a space? So I feel like one of the reasons why I wanted to use that Rosalind Krauss drawing is I wanted to be able to say, like, this is a really vast territory.
Hmm.
And the projects that I discuss in the book are only just, shall we say, little intensities,
Hmm.
little nodal points or little vectors, trajectories within this field, but there are all kinds of other ways in which architectural and choreographic practice might um, be hybridized, might come into context in which they occur, things that they produce.
What's I suppose, the theoretical disposition out of which this comes? Is this a sort of idea, a Latourian idea of sort of actor network? Is it a kind of phenomenological idea about reality and perception? Is it, I guess the list could go on. Is there a kind of a broader theoretical idea about space and time and humans that you find has guided your thinking in this?
I would say, and this may be surprising or not surprising, I would say if anybody shows up in the book um, more than anybody else in the in the realm of theory and philosophy, it's Michel Foucault.
Okay. The most cited scholar in history.
You
He is. Why Foucault?
know, the most obvious would or the assumption that one might most quickly come to is, of course, the disciplining bodies, right? We talk about being able to read bodies in space and their positionality in a hierarchy
Hmm.
within an institution, the training which is down to the body parts and the movements of those body parts in
Hmm.
time, kind of chronometric precision of the movements of military bodies. That would be the first obvious connection, but actually what interests me more is the discussion of the dispositive and his discussion of critique. So thinking about architecture as a dispositive that choreographs architecture as a again, to refer back to William Forsythe, he writes about choreographic objects, objects which choreograph us. You can even like a simple example would be like a lever handle on a door. It choreographs a certain gesture
Hmm.
of a body. And in fact, all constructs, whether we're talking about institutions or telephones or um, buildings, there's a relationship to the human, which there's a struggle in the human's relationship to these constructs.
Hmm.
And the creative process and the critical process are about perhaps finding ways of overcoming and challenging and pressing up against and perhaps beyond the boundaries of the limits that these constructs, these dispositives, apparatuses, whatever, present to us.
Hmm.
And so in some parts of the book, I'm exploring how the norms and the conventions of architecture or the norms and conventions of, let's say, classical ballet, that some of these projects were opportunities to shed light on, perhaps even poke fun of the conventions that we just take for granted within our fields. And in others, perhaps in a less explicitly critical way, some of the collaborations were opportunities to really push the boundaries of what can a body do and be in relationship to a particular kind of space, and how does that dance or choreography reveal, perhaps even break the space, um, expose architecture's fragility, perhaps.
Yeah, I like that. I like that idea that because obviously there's this built into these two words, architecture and choreography. You have the architect and the choreographer, who are two leaders. They're the brains behind the operation. They're the visionaries. But then you have the dancer or dancers for whom their bodies and the space are the constraining factors and their tiredness, you know? And so I really like this idea that thrown into this mix is this random element, much like in architecture, where the client and the building and materials, the physical structuring of the building, and then the architect's intention can posit itself as a solution to a given spatial problem. And then the people come along and they use it entirely differently. And you see this all the time, in very simple ways, like people not walking on pathways across, there's some on the campus that I'm on at the moment, there's these lovely examples where they've given us generous paths. They're just in the wrong damn place. And so there's new paths, which are just muddy paths because it's winter now and a mess. Anyway, so I quite like this idea. I mean, how is within this continuum, and perhaps you could give us some examples from the staccatos, as you call them in the book, these examples. How does this triumvirate, those three agents, operate within this space?
Yeah, we could say there's the architect, there's the choreographer,
Hmm.
there, Bill T. Jones refers to his dancers as his sublime materials. And
And then there's the audience, of course, but well,
and there's the audience, and then there's the architectural, the thing, the artifact
mm.
with its materiality, its gravity, its wear and tear.
You're talking about the
Um,
sets here or the actual building itself.
yeah, yeah. Well, in most of the cases within the book, there are constructed environments.
Hmm.
There's one chapter that focuses more on, shall we say, site specific or site generated work,
Hmm.
um, where the architecture is the existing cityscape.
Hmm.
Um, but let me think here for a moment about some some examples.
Well,
There's a piece called Spill Out, which was a collaboration between Francis Burnett, who um, is an architectural educator, and Ellen Sinopoli, a choreographer. And that project, which quite quickly in the collaboration, it was decided that they would be working within a kind of a scaffold wrapped with an elastic type material, and that the choreography would be generated through improvisation, exercises, prompts given both by the architect and the choreographer to the dancers to explore the limits of what if, how can, this or that in relationship both to the steel, I believe it was steel structure, and these elastic fabric tensile materials. How far can you push? How much can you lean back and be supported by this expanding material? And so the choreography was very much generated in dialogue as a collaboration with inputs from the dancers. And as Francis Burnett, described to me, there was also not only the fatigue of the dancers that had to be taken into consideration, but there was also material fatigue. And so
mm,
when they performed multiple days, the elastic material became more and more slack. And so the choreography had to adapt
mhm,
to that, um, knowing that the fabric would be less supportive, it would be more elastic and giving, and that the dancers would have to be very conscious of that changing set of circumstances and in response to the material resistance. And a
mm,
very similar thing I could say was at play in a work called Civic Mimic by choreographer Richard Siegel with an environment created by Francois Roche, in which this kind of forking tabletop
mhm.
was this very thin and flexing material on thousands of spindly little legs. And so the structure was swaying and flexing under the dancer's feet.
I was wondering how it would work because the image of it is like the architect to me is like there must have been big chains or a stick somewhere, but there was nothing.
No, they're literally, it's like a centipede.
Yeah, yeah.
It's like a bi-headed centipede. And so that design in many ways was a spatial manifestation of the kind of choreographic attitude that Richard Siegel brings to his work. He's very interested in feedback loops. He's very interested in open-ended generative kind of algorithms or formulas in which, like, if I do X, then you do Y, but if you do Y, then so and so can do either A or B.
Hmm.
And so there's a kind of a forking path of possible sequences. But he also works with um, non-professional dancers who he invites into the space uh, to do kind of crowd movements. He invites the dancers to mimic members of the public and thereby improvise and act as a kind of a mirror to what's going on in the room. So there's a whole recipe of potential source materials that the dancers are drawing from live. And at the same time, they've got this tabletop that they're standing on, which is flexing and swaying under their
Mm,
feet. So they may have the intention to do an arabesque on one land, but on one leg, but because of the wobbliness of the table, they're going to do that on their knee with two hands holding onto the table in order to
hmm.
keep their balance. So, so they're also responding live to the feedback
Mm,
from the environment,
yeah.
entirely based on its kind of structural and material principles.
I like. this idea a lot, and it kind of leads elegantly, particularly that project, the
Civic mimic.
yeah, leads on quite elegantly to your chapter five, which in part three, dance, chapter five, which you've called dancing architecture. So this kind of moves beyond the sites idea of dancing in and around architecture, and it moves on from this dispositif chapter which precedes it into the idea of architecture as a much more active and live agent within the production of dance, of the choreographic production of dance. Or in a way, I suppose the architecture is itself choreographed. It becomes something
Yeah.
that requires coding and mode of practice. Do I understand that right?
Yeah, no, very much so. And there's a there's a kind of an interesting historical moment that kind of sets up that chapter as well, which is that the New York architects Todd Williams and Billy Tien attended a performance of Available Light by Lucinda Childs and Frank Gehry, in which Gehry created this split stage. And in its original presentation in Los Angeles, there was also a split audience and even sub-splits within the space of the audience that created what he refers to as these people relationships,
Hmm.
where audience members are viewing audience members across and against this other dynamic, which is the choreography. But when Todd Williams and Billy Tien attended that performance at the Brooklyn Academy of Music, they asked themselves, couldn't the architecture dance? While there was a dynamic to that splitting of the stage, um, could the architecture be more dynamic? Could it be a dancer amongst dancers?
Hmm.
And so when they were invited by Lisamonte to collaborate on The World Upside Down, they were very interested in thinking about the architecture as a dancer amongst dancers.
Hmm.
And while they really kind of created one main dancer, it was this giant folding wall. I want to say it was like 40 feet long with a giant hinge that moves across the stage. It unfolds, it turns inside out, it becomes a scrim, it becomes a backdrop, it becomes a prow of a ship that cantilevers out over the orchestra pit. And it's interesting to see in the artifacts of the work process, the choreographers work with the physical model,
Hmm.
quite literally placing this miniature architecture in different ways within the space and then drawing the bodies in relationship to that.
Hmm.
And so there's the evidence of her choreographing the architecture.
Hmm.
And of course, Todd and Billy were very keen that that that's what the intention was,
Hmm.
that this would be a tool for the choreographer to include within her corps de ballet. And there are many projects within the book beyond just that one chapter. There are many examples in which the architect created a kind of toolkit that the choreographer could work with so that it wasn't merely a static object, it wasn't a static frame, it wasn't a container, but whether it was some kind of malleable tool that could be transformed over time,
Hmm.
conceivably moving in space as well.
Hmm.
Um, and one of the things that I try to unpack within that chapter is what potentially happens when architecture, which we count on in a kind of Vitruvian sense of it's going to be stable, it's going to be grounded, it's going to have foundations, it's going to stay still, and all of a sudden it becomes lightweight, packable in a suitcase, potentially suspended, comes apart, transforms, might even lose its identity entirely as being separate from the larger house of the theater or even the dancing bodies. What
Hmm.
happens when the architecture actually becomes just an extension of the body? Um, that may prompt us to think about what our role, what our job is as an architect in a very different way.
Hmm. I quite like that. The idea of the building becoming an active agent. As you were talking, and you were talking particularly about Todd Williams, Billy Sen's idea, Gary's idea, struck me that I've been talking to one of my master's students recently. He's writing up his dissertation on civic theatres from the 1950s and what they were trying to achieve, which was quite evidently, as I read it, a kind of a civic discourse around civic responsibility and essentially politics, I suppose. And contemporary theatres and contemporary theatrical production for the common man, certainly for normal people, as I like to call them, has gone down a kind of Disney-fied, what do they call it, jukebox kind of musical kind of thing. And it's rather terrifying and awful in many ways. And the theatres themselves reflect that. The theatres produced for this, or they reflect that. There's something interesting in that. But I was thinking as you were talking, it's almost like these choreographers and the architectural designers or the spatial designers and the performance and then the audience are all becoming part of the production of a kind of civic discourse around the meaning of citizenship, of identity, of personhood as individuals, as within communities, which I think is a kind of fascinating idea that when you introduce an architect into this environment, it actually transforms the opportunities a choreographer has to reach beyond the confines of their discipline into a broader dialogue. Is that a fair thing to say? Did you find that in your work that
Hmm.
that the presence of quote unquote designers, architects, changes the way that the choreographers, or is it always led fundamentally by the choreographer who drives the discourse?
Thanks for that question. That's really provocative thoughts, and I'm gonna point to one example in the book that I
Yeah,
think
please.
speaks to what you're articulating there. Several of the projects really emerged out of multi-year conversations between two individuals who just liked talking to one another.
Hmm.
Um, and thus making of a work was an opportunity to explore that intellectual friendship um, in another way. Um, get real, have the rubber hit the road in terms of like what happens when we take your ideas and hybridize them with my ideas, and we try to explore that with bodies and time. Um, some of the choreographers are very conscious and working with sociopolitical ideas and thinking about this, the spaces of civic life and domestic life, political life, before the architect shows up.
Hmm.
Um, there's a whole spectrum. So there are some incredibly spatial and civic thinking choreographers, and there are some very non-civic, some very non-civic architects.
Do you think?
Yeah, no, and so there's everything in between, and so not and this is where I don't want to get myself in trouble. Um, there are collaborations in which the questions that were asked might have been more about what can we make, what can we learn, what can we celebrate if we immerse ourselves in the life and the work of the painter Francis Bacon or the life and the music of Johann Sebastian Bach. And there might be aspects of uh, sociopolitical civic life that emerges within that. Certainly, there are sociopolitical questions that come up in relationship to Francis Bacon's life. Um, but those weren't necessarily the drivers in those pieces. There may be facets of those kinds of ideas that come out through other ideas as a result of other ideas that somehow the domestic space and the public space or the social space impact aspects of the work, either in terms of the choreography or the environment. But there are examples in the book. There are architects and choreographers who were probably interested in collaborating with one another because they were interested in shared uh, aspirations to propose alternative sociabilities, propose other ways of being a community in community with one another, um, how the entire event of making a work attending a performance, being a member of a community that goes to attend a performance in a space and returns to that space during non-performance time as a performer of civic life is all kind of part of a continuum. And I think that those are probably um, ideas that informed architect Nicholas Hirsch and William Forsythe teaming up to work together to renovate and reimagine the interior of the Bockenheimer Depot as both an environment in which performances are made,
mm,
but also an environment in which the public gathers
mm,
as a toolkit that also provides props and objects
mm,
used in dance performances, but also props and objects that support playtime and happy hour
mm,
and all kinds of different activities, seminars, dance parties, indoor picnics uh, that the public shaped and reshaped using the provided kit of parts.
mm,
So they, in a certain sense, they are invited into the architectural act and exploring how to be a body through a gift that Hirsch and Forsyth gave to the public.
mm,
And it's very clear civic life was at the forefront of their minds
mm.
in the developing of the work that they did together.
And there's also this other idea that going back to Foucault just struck me as you were talking about it, particularly Forsyth's work, that there's a sort of construction of a heterotopia as well, a space for a certain group of people within a society who have an aesthetic disposition towards, say, for example, contemporary dance, a space in which they can share their vision. And I wonder this particularly with regard to some of your, some of the more contemporary dance, well, some of the they're all contemporary dance pieces, but the
Yes, they are.
contemporary dance as a whole is not
Yeah.
obviously
Some
something,
of them are ballets. Some of them are ballets, and some
are
of them
they?
are modern dances, and some of them are like almost unnameable because they don't fit into a singular
Yeah.
definition.
But does that make sense? Is the point to create in a way, again, to use your phrase, a feedback loop between a public, a specific and identified public? Is this what's going on? I mean, maybe this is a question that's outside the bounds of your research, but I'm kind of interested in that.
Well, I'm gonna take the Foucault and I'm gonna take another aspect of it, which is the opportunities of these works, the process of collaboration, the things that they produce, and how they're experienced as forms of critical reflection and pushing the boundaries of what is thinkable as within the realm of architecture or within the realm of dance,
Mm,
um, to try and expand what is to expand what is possible as a way of perhaps addressing some of the critical issues of our times. So if uh, part of our challenge today is being with the other,
mhm,
being with others, being with unlike ourselves, then how can, for instance, works like Civic Mimic, which bring, street dance groups into the lobby space of the Théâtre de Chaillot, bringing groups of people together who normally might not ever meet. Um, many of the individuals whose work is in this book, I'm interested in their work because they are trying to push the boundaries and they are open to the idea of being challenged by somebody who is working in a allied or not apparently, but allied field,
mm,
but with incredibly different tools
mm,
and constraints that are very challenging when we begin to take them on. So the gravity and the weight and the cost of architecture and all of the physicality of it and what that presents as a challenge uh, for the choreographer and the dancers
mm,
from a production point of view, from a spatial constraint point of view, How do I dance within this or on this thing? To the other end of the spectrum, in which the architect is challenged to create things that are nimble, flexible, transformative,
Mm,
um, probably broken many times by dancers, um, and literally pushing things to the limit
mm,
and being willing to say, that's good. We should test to failure.
mm,
We should actually see what the limits are of the things that we make and learn maybe a little bit more about the human um, in that process. As you were saying earlier, we design things and then, oh, those misbehaving humans, they do completely different things than what we thought. Um, and there are multiple interviews in which, architects shared their surprise, their pleasant surprise, but their surprise nonetheless of what the dancers who are professionals at being bodies pushing the limits of what a body can do
mm,
and taking the architecture with them on that adventure and really pushing the architecture to failure,
mm,
um, because they are enacting ways of being a body that isn't sitting politely and still in a chair with,
mhm,
a center of gravity, that is predictable.
mm.
Anyhow, I'm rambling.
No, 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 it's really wonderful. I just want to finish on one last thing, which to go back to something that we mentioned at the beginning, which is your mode of research practice, which I'm kind of interested in. How did you go about undertaking this research? Obviously, there was documentation, obviously, there was conversation. Did you also dance? Did you experience some of these things? Was it action research?
I can't say that I danced any of these dances, no.
What a shame.
No, I know, I
Or
know.
maybe for your knees, it's not a shame.
My knees are okay. No, that unfortunately um, was not a part of the research. I did attend many rehearsals and
Mm,
performances, studios, archives, interviewed
mm,
each of the architects and each of the choreographers in the book, or a member of their team
yeah.
who was deeply involved in the making of the project and could speak to the work. Um, Watched many videos, many, 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 many times. Drew took notes during performances, drew based on photographs and videos, constructed drawings of the spaces that involved in the case of site-specific work, but even non-site specific work, contacting the theaters to learn about, the theater machinery, the size of the stage, the shape of the audience space, um, to really understand the kind of nested nature of the dance within a space, within a larger space.
So there's a very designerly kind of aspect to the production of the work itself, kind of drawing and mapping and
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I admit I'm an architect. I confess. Um, I mean, there are a couple of instances in which I was sufficiently close to the work being made during its phase of development that I might have participated in like a research
hmm
activity with the company, like
hmm
maybe two or three times. Um, with some companies, I sat literally and watched rehearsal for 2 weeks, or saw multiple work in progress showings.
hmm
But I'll admit, I have, as somebody who loves to dance, I did not take dance classes with any of these choreographers. Maybe that's another chapter. Maybe that's the chapter about the hybrid practice.
Yeah.
Maybe that hasn't happened yet.
If you had to pick one of these out as a best example of your thesis, could you? Would you?
Oh God, that's like, which is your
Which of
favorite
which of
child?
your children is your favorite? Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah. But I've never hidden the fact that both aesthetically, conceptually, politically, even I guess, um, the work of William Forsythe has always really deeply interested me.
hmm
From from his trying to push the boundaries of classical ballet, pushing its language to a breaking point, but then also the live feedback that sets up a choreography in which there is elasticity and agency for the dancers. So going back to what I was mentioning before, when the set of instructions that are transmitted from the choreographer or the architect to the person who is enacting the work, and they have license and agency. As an audience member, you can feel the difference of when somebody is live thinking, problem solving the dancing versus when they are literally just going through the motions, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's something very political about the empowering of the dancer that Forsyth talks about in some of his writing. Um, and even the way the kind of collaboration with Nicholas Hirsch, thinking about the design is not only the design of the space, but it's also the designing of the nature of the institution that houses this company that wants to have a different kind of relationship with the public.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was I think, a very pertinent kind of example set by that collaboration and what they made that I think is very important today in terms of how we think about being active designers and participants, choreographers, architects of our civil society, civic spaces, the way we dance with others, whether we dance well with others or not. Um, and that's one of the weirder projects in the book, I'll admit. It's not it's not the most traditional in the sense that the design of the environment was the support for multiple performances, not just a singular dance.
Well, that's a wonderful point to finish on, Beth. Thank you so very much. I've enjoyed listening to you talk about this a great deal. I've learned a lot.
Thank you so much. It's been a real honor and pleasure.
As Robert Frost put it, we dance round in a ring and suppose, but the secret sits in the middle and knows. So does Beth, as her excellent book shows. Thank you to Beth for her thoughtful conversation, for taking the time to speak with me. Thank you to Routledge for the wonderful book. Please see the podcast description for links to the book and to Beth's professional profile. And thanks for listening.